The largest power plant in America, by net generation, is the Palo Verde nuclear plant outside Phoenix, Arizona. Normally, nuclear plants have to be located adjacent to large bodies of water. As a matter of fact, Palo Verde is the only nuke plant in the world that isn't near a body of water. It's in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. Instead of drawing from the ocean or a lake or river, Palo Verde uses wastewater from local sewage treatment plants. Speaking of desert, deep in the inner reaches of California, on the edge of Death Valley National Park, lies one of the most distinguished higher education facilities in the state. Graduates include Pulitzer Prize winners, U.S. ambassadors, and congressmen. Deep Springs College is a two-year college which restricts enrollment to 26 undergrads. Tuition is free, and the school's mission is based around the pursuit of academics, labor, and self-governance. Students are required to do things like milk cows and saddle horses, in addition to learning ancient Greek and reading classics. Speaking of the Great Basin, looking at a population map of Utah, it's pretty clear most people live in the Wasatch Front area. Except you may also notice this clump of people in the southwestern corner of the state. St. George is kind of just in the middle of nowhere. It's over 100 miles from Las Vegas, and it's about as close to Phoenix as it is to Salt Lake City. Why is it there? Because of the Civil War. In the year 1861, Brigham Young was worried that they might lose access to southern cotton, and decided that Utah needed to start growing its own. The only issue was climate, so the Mormons essentially drafted 100 families and sent them to the far reaches of the state to grow cotton at the very southern border of Utah. It barely worked, and today St. George is known mostly for outdoor recreation. Speaking of borders, most Americans associate border wars with faraway lands, but there's one happening right now in North America. In the 1630s, a group called the Baymen settled modern-day Belize, despite the fact that it was Spanish territory. Their presence was a pseudo-British colony, however control was officially established after the Baymen won the Battle of St. George Cay in 1798. Fast forward hundreds of years, a bunch of treaties, and we have this dotted line between Belize and Guatemala. It's very disputed and has led to deaths as recently as 2016. Speaking of Anyways, during the 12th and 13th centuries AD, Merv might have been the world's largest city, with a population of up to 500,000 people. Where is Merv? Right here, in present-day Turkmenistan, along the Silk Road. Merv predates Turkmenistan, having been settled in some capacity from the 3rd millennium BC until the 1800s, when, under pressure from Russia, Merv was completely deserted. Now, what's left of Merv is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Totally unrelated, but Turkmenistan has a space program and an active satellite in orbit right now. Just thought that was interesting. Speaking of the Silk Road, it wasn't really anything new at the time. The steppe route, which facilitated trans-Eurasian trade, predates the Silk Road by at least 2 millennia. The Silk Road was more organized and documented, but it was a common misconception that it was the first time Europeans were able to trade with Asians. Speaking of Europeans, Old New York was once New Amsterdam, but did you know Old Wilmington, Delaware was once New Sweden? Well, not really, but Sweden did build a fort, which eventually developed into a town, handed over to the Dutch and then the English, who founded Wilmington and eventually ceded the land to the Americans. This was about the only attempt at Swedish colonization in America, and it didn't last too long, although there is a museum in Philadelphia you can visit to learn more. Speaking of relocation, there are no monkeys native to the U.S. However, that doesn't mean there are no monkeys in the U.S. As a matter of fact, there's an island off the coast of South Carolina home to 4,000 rhesus monkeys and 0 people. Morgan Island is the home to an ongoing research project that was relocated from Puerto Rico due to the risk of disease reaching the local population. Speaking of islands, you've probably heard of Cajun people before. Their food is certainly held in high regard, but beyond that, what else do you know about them? Maybe you associate Louisiana with the Cajuns, but where did they come from before that? The answer is Canada. These Cajuns were just Acadians, like the national park in Maine, French settlers who had been forcibly relocated by the British from eastern Canada to the nearest large Catholic settlement, Louisiana. Speaking of Canada, in 1881, 25 members of the U.S. Army embarked on an expedition to Lady Franklin Bay in Nunavut, Canada. 1881 was an unusually warm year, and so accessing the remote area where they staged base camp was remarkably easy. In 1882, when a resupply ship tried to make it back to the bay, it was unable to break through the ice. As a matter of fact, it was unable to even make it to the backup location where supplies were to be dropped if ice was an issue. The soldiers were not able to be rescued until nearly 3 years after they set out on the expedition, and by the time a crew got to them, only 7 men had survived. The rest had succumbed to starvation, hypothermia, drowning, and in one man's case, Private Henry, had been shot for repeated theft of food rations. Speaking of potential cannibalism, Sable Island is a crescent-shaped island about 100 miles off the coast of Nova Scotia. Essentially a glorified sandbar, it's not even a mile wide at its thickest point. It makes sense that this island is virtually uninhabited, but of course, that hasn't stopped people from trying to inhabit it. Going back all the way to 1598, where 50 to 60 criminals and 10 soldiers were sent to this remote island off the mainland of a virtually unknown continent. They had supplies to make it through the first winter with the goal of being self-sufficient eventually on this island. The project was spearheaded by Chaulieu de Musgat Marquis de la Roche-Glomache, who promptly stopped supporting the island after realizing it was doomed to fail. The last supply ship was sent in 1602, and by then there were only 11 people left on the island. It was a gruesome sight, but upon return, each survivor was given 50 silver coins. Speaking of European forays into Canada, some of the earliest Europeans to visit the New World were the Basques. It was unclear exactly when this was, but conservative estimates usually start after the year 1525. However, some reputable historians claim that the Basque people were whaling off the coast of Newfoundland before Columbus sailed to the West Indies. The Basque Whalers spent so much time in Canada that they developed an entire dialect to speak with the Native Americans called Algonquin Basque Pidgin. Speaking of Canada, Canadians who defected to support the Americans during the Revolutionary War were rewarded with parcels of land in Ohio. Over 50,000 acres of land were given to 67 people in an area of Ohio known as the Refugee Tract near modern-day Columbus. Speaking of Ohio, it used to be Connecticut, at least some of it. You see, in 1796, Connecticut claimed this land and held it for a whopping 4 years before it was ceded. In that time, settlers began to trickle in. Youngstown was founded in 1796, Warren in 1798, Hudson and Ravenna in 1799. The Western Reserve, as it was called, was arguably the most anti-slavery region of the country in the pre-Civil War period, according to John Brown Jr. So, if you've ever wondered what the deal with Case Western Reserve University's name is, it's named after a guy named Case, and it's in the former Western Reserve. There's no such thing as a reserve university, which is news to me. Speaking of Connecticut, in 2011, a set of wild Canadian lynx tracks were found there. Lynxes are not normally found in that range, they're found here. They're pretty rare, a lot rarer than bobcats, which can be found in this range, or cougars, which are found in this range. But there are even more species of wild cats that have been spotted in the US, including jaguars like El Jefe, margays, and jaguarundi. These animals are extremely rare to spot in the US because they're all native to Mexico and have to travel quite far to cross the border, but they have been spotted. Speaking of borders, they're edges, and the Pacific Ocean forms the edge of the Americas. But who was the first American to touch the Pacific Ocean? Of course, Native Americans had been doing it for tens of thousands of years. Now, you might be inclined to say Lewis and Clark, but that's not true. They reached the Pacific in 1805, decades after sailors like Samuel Hill had gotten there. But even before the fur traders, a man named John Ledyard, born in Connecticut, walked along the west coast of the US. If you want to learn how that ended up happening, check out this video that I made about John Ledyard. He's a really interesting person. Anyways, thanks for watching. Apologies for the mic quality and everything. I had to record on my phone. It's just a mess, but thanks for watching anyways. Let me know if you want more random information.